welcome to the Foggy Dew. This is Colin. Well, gang, I hope everyone had a wonderful Memorial Day with your families. Memorial Day has always been one of my favorite holidays. It's just a great day about America. It's a day that you want to celebrate your veterans, those heroes that served our country, the fallen heroes of our country. It's just a day that's blocked off to respect our military and think about the sacrifices that they gave for our freedom. And it's interesting, I think we live in a consumer culture now where everything's like just like an Instagram post or a TikTok or whatever it might be. And you see all this stuff about Memorial Day, it's all about the party, right? It's about the time on the boat. It's about the time on the golf course. It's about the America bikini, the America swim trunks, right? The fireworks. It's about the party. And I think that gets lost in our consumer culture with social media and all the other things that go along with it. And I think it's interesting that when you think about Memorial Day, to think about where it came from. And you might be interested to know that Memorial Day was not passed by an act of Congress. It was actually Memorial Day was started as a grassroots effort by citizens to celebrate veterans of the Civil War. So Memorial Day started all the way back shortly after 1865. You had about 750,000 people that died in the Civil War. 750,000 Americans died in the Civil War. Well, after the war ended, everybody went back home. And of course, we're sharing the same space, right? You could have a Confederate at one door, Union the next house. But with all those people dead, what that meant is you had fresh graves. Families had been destroyed. Brother fought brother. You had widows. You had new empty chairs at dinners when families would congregate. You just had a real grief and a loss. We were all Americans fighting each other. It was a horrific thing, and people started celebrating that. They started celebrating the sacrifice of the people that gave so much in the Civil War. So here you have the American citizenry after 1865. They started paying their respects to the fallen soldiers of the Civil War. And it wasn't just one or two people. It would be like a town. So you would have a town that would say, okay, we're going to have a day where we're just going to celebrate our Civil War veterans. Well, what they would do is they would organize visits to cemeteries. They would take wreaths. They would take flowers. They would lay flowers at those graves. But people back then in the towns would honor their dead. And again, it was a day to think about the sacrifice, giving your life to a cause bigger than you. Now, Memorial Day itself was actually started by a guy named General John Logan. So this General John Logan guy saw what was occurring in these towns, and what he did is he drafted a general order that codified May 30th as what they called Decoration Day. So Decoration Day was first observed at Arlington National Cemetery. That was Robert E. Lee's ancestral home. But at Arlington, in that first Decoration Day, what they did is they laid flowers not just at Union soldiers' graves, but at Confederate soldiers' graves. And the whole viewpoint there was that we were all the same. Union and Confederate soldier alike. They were all heroes. They were all brothers. We were trying to repair what had happened. Now, as time went on, you kind of moved away from the Civil War, right? So you had World War I occur. Well, after World War I, that whole day of celebrating Civil War soldiers was then expanded to all U.S. soldiers, not just ones that died in the Civil War. So you continue to have this kind of like May 30th celebration of our veterans. Well, it went all the way to 1971 before Memorial Day was actually recognized as a federal holiday. And then what happened is that in 1971, Memorial Day became the last Monday in May. Again, I just think it's a great day. It is a day to remember all we have been given by our military. And it's just so interesting even talking about the history of Memorial Day and Decoration Day and it being a truly unique American holiday. It's so interesting to me because I guess a few people don't understand that history or care about it. And probably don't care is a little bit more accurate. Now, I've talked about this person on the show before. That would be Jacob Frey. Jacob Frey is the mayor of Minneapolis. And I'm sorry, this made me mental. So forgive me if I'm a little heated when I'm talking about this. But Jacob Frey is a weak, beta male communist. He is a woke clown. So this man posted this on Memorial Day. He posted this on X. Here's Mayor Jacob Frey. Quote, today, this man does this on Memorial Day. Mayor Jacob Frey on X, quote, today we remember George Floyd, who was murdered by a former Minneapolis police officer 6 years ago. That moment changed our city forever. Then he did a second post. We are committed to honoring this place both as a memorial with global significance and as a neighborhood where people live, work, gather, and heal. The work ahead is bigger than any one moment or administration. Then he did a third one. Here's his third post, quote, the weight of what happened is still with our city 6 years later, and the responsibility to keep moving forward together is too. I know we can keep building a Minneapolis that is safer, more accountable, and more worthy of the people who call it home, end quote. Okay. Okay, so you want to post about George Floyd on Memorial Day? And I guess, all right, even if you agree with what this man is saying, which is totally divisive and silly, you're basically remembering a drug addict. You're basically remembering a guy that beat women. He was a drug addict. He sold drugs. He assaulted people. Yes, he shouldn't have died in that manner, but you're lionizing a felon. You're lionizing a felon on the day that we're supposed to be respecting our military who gave their last measure of devotion for our freedom. Because my problem with all of what he put on this, he posted about George Floyd and he didn't post anything about Memorial Day. He didn't post one thing about Memorial Day. So he goes on this like insane screed about George Floyd and then forgets to recognize our fallen soldiers, our service members who gave so much. And to be totally clear, knowing this person, watching him, observing him through the media, I wouldn't expect him to do. I wouldn't expect him to honor our brave soldiers. You know why? Because he's a woke communist. And to a woke communist, it's never about honoring history. It's not about honoring tradition. It's all about the struggle, the class struggle. He's got to keep that fire burning. Because to a communist, the past is elastic. And that's exactly what the past is to a guy like Jacob Frey. The past is totally elastic. It's only the future and the struggle that matter. Who's the governor in Minnesota? Well, for right now, it's Tim Walz. Tim Walz, who had his political career nuked off the planet by a kid named Nick Shirley. But here's Tim Walz jumping on the Floyd train on Memorial Day. And to be fair, before I get into Walz's comments, Walz actually did post about Memorial Day. See, I'll just go ahead and go through the quote. So here's Governor Tim Walz. So here's his first post, quote, on Memorial Day, Minnesotans come together to remember the heroes who gave their lives for the freedom and values that define our great nation. Let us never forget those brave service members and their families, end quote. Okay, that's fine. I don't know if he believes one thing he's saying, but that's fine. He got it out there, so he checked that box. But he wasn't done. Instead of leaving Memorial Day for the brave people that landed at D-Day, at Anzio, right, all of our brave soldiers in World War I, the Civil War, instead of leaving this day for those brave heroes, he decided to go ahead and post also about George Floyd. So here's Tim Walz. After he does recognize Memorial Day, Governor Tim Walz, quote, 6 years ago today, George Floyd's murder started a global movement for change. Let us continue working to build a society that lives up to democratic ideals of liberty and justice for all, end quote. A global movement for change? Is that what's reviled everywhere other than Minnesota? Continue working to build a society that lives up to its democratic ideals of liberty and justice for all. I mean, never miss a moment, man. You know what I have a problem with insofar as this is concerned? This man was a VP candidate. This guy was a VP candidate that about 45% of the people in the United States decided to go behind a voting booth, pull the curtain, and pull the lever for this clown. That's buffoonish, clownish behavior. You don't post that on Memorial Day. It's about the soldiers in our military. But I guess, look, again, a VP candidate who's sitting here posting about George Floyd on Memorial Day. And then you have the mayor that oversaw the whole thing, posting nothing but George Floyd stuff. It's totally tone deaf, is my point. It's completely tone deaf to the family, to the widow with her young child crying at a gravesite on that day. And again, it's not just the people nationally that pulled the curtain to vote for a guy like Tim. How dead asleep and radicalized are the people in Minneapolis and Minnesota broadly? They keep electing people like this. People like Jacob Frey are like the Democrat media darlings. But I guess my main takeaway from this is shame on these guys for doing this. It's totally divisive to do it on a day like Memorial Day. But I guess always listen to what the Foggy Dew has to say. Watch your opposition. Always watch what they're saying. You can watch what Tim Walz posts. You can watch what Jacob Frey posts, Obama, any of these people. Always watch the response. But trust me, I'm not just going to be watching the response. I'm watching all these people like a hawk. So I did have a little bit of a quick hit, kind of to give you a little bit more positive news going into the week. I'm always watching polls and maps. I want to watch where people and money are flowing. I think it's so interesting. It kind of gives the game away. And I've talked about it on the show before, but all capital in the United States is flowing red. People are flowing red. People are leaving blue in droves. I mean, you've got blue cities and states, just like Minnesota and Minneapolis. People are leaving these places. If you own a business, you're not putting your stakes down where a guy like Jacob Frey is in charge of things. Would you, if you're a serious business person, would you really ever want to get in bed with a guy like Jacob Frey or Tim Walz? No, of course not. You'd rather go to a place like Florida with like a DeSantis or whatever, where they're going to protect your money. But again, these policies of blue are shoving these people out of cities and states. And I guess the point of this is that if you look post 2030, when the electoral math changes, red is going to be firmly in control of politics for decades. I mean, I'll just go through it. You've got California, Illinois, New York, Minnesota. They're losing people. And then you have places like Florida, Texas, North Carolina, Tennessee, Oklahoma. Those places are gaining people. But this entire tectonic shift from blue to red, it sets up the 2030 census. And I've talked about it again. I talk about this stuff all the time on the show. That new 2030 electoral map is terminal for the Democrat Party. So 2030 with the new census is terminal for the party. 2026 is the Alamo. It is the last stand of the Democrat Party as a national contender. And that math and that train of logic is bearing out when you start looking at the 2026 Senate maps. OSZ had some data that came out on the Senate for 2026. Polling today, done by this very reputable source, polling today suggests that in 2026, this is going to be the composition of the Senate. Red is going to have 52. The Democrat Party will have 45, and they have 3 races as toss-ups. And those 3 toss-up states are Michigan, North Carolina, and then Georgia. And all 3 of those states, if you look at it, are trending red. And I think Georgia specifically with this, Georgia elected Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock. I'm convinced that there's shenanigans going on down there in Georgia with the voting. And I think what's happening is that they're correcting all that right now. Like a guy like Brad Raffensperger is in a ton of trouble down there. He's a Republican that was he was the Secretary of State. He was very involved in the vote. All the voting is getting disassembled down there in Georgia. But again, if your toss-ups are Michigan, North Carolina, and Georgia, well, all 3 of those states, I think I just mentioned them, all 3 of those states are trending red in one way or another. So what that does is if you look at it that way, if you're saying, okay, blue is going to control 45 with 3 as toss-up, then that means that the ceiling for the Democrat Party blue would be 48 in the Senate. 48 is their ceiling. So they're not going to be in the majority even when the new legislature is sworn in. And the interesting thing about it is if you look at the cycle beyond that, the election cycle beyond the 2026 one is going to be even worse. So I guess that's the point, is that all of this is trending very, very badly for the Democrat Party nationally. And if you look at all the factors when you start looking at 2026 and pulling it apart, because I know a lot of people are worried about 2026. So you're now starting to see the polling bearing out that the ceiling for blue in the Senate is 48. You have all these factors out there. You have the SAVE Act out there. You've got Trump's mail-in ballot executive order out there. You've got the Voting Rights Act being found unconstitutional. All of the USAID money's gone. You're seeing structural fraud in these blue cities and states being exposed, blown up. If you look at the price of crude oil, it looks like crude is coming down. There was news that was coming out of Iran over the weekend. The Iran deal should be coming soon. I think the Dow is set to explode. I think AI is going to keep growing in the market. I think companies are going to be leveraging AI more effectively. I think companies are going to get leaner, smarter. You're going to have the 250th anniversary of America. It's going to be just like a huge red, white, and blue explosion, just like in a month or two. So you look at all these factors and you just have all these economic, cultural shifts possible to red. And I guess even if you dive back into the numbers here, 52 Senate seats is expected for red, with 55 possible today. And in the future, that math gets better. And I guess going back to my point on this is that even if the Democrat Party somehow wins the House in 2026, they're not going to be able to do much. You're not going to be able to do much with a blue Congress with a red Senate. You're going to have a loggerhead. So they can do all their investigations of Trump. They can try to impeach him, but it's never going to pass muster in the Senate. And that's even assuming that they win in 2026. And if you're asking me right now, I mean, you're now starting to see the data on the Senate. The Senate looks to me like it's going to be controlled red by a lot, not by a little. I think right now that the Congress is going to go about 60-40 red. I think this whole thing has been bared out. It's exposed. I think the whole scam has been exposed. I think there's so many things, so many variables that are trending the correct way. This whole idea that the Democrat Party is a lock to win Congress in 2026, I think is a total fallacy. I don't think that's correct. Because if you look at the internal polling on Congress, it's pretty flimsy, man. And a lot of it is working off the historical context that the party out of power, in this case meaning the Democrat Party, they always win the midterms against a second-term incumbent president. But I think looking at the scope of politics has changed so much in 10 years. I think people are just now understanding how broadly things have changed. The parties are not even remotely the same as they were 10 years ago. The electorate is not the same as it was 10 years ago. So I think working off historical context, I don't think there's a context here because I think the whole situation on the ground is different. But again, you're starting to see the trend line that the Senate will go red. And again, I'm going to maintain that the House is going to stay in Republican hands. And then you'd have another 2 years of Trump just totally unleashed. So anyway, it's going to be fascinating. I love it. So kind of staying in the same vein with polling, I saw two separate polls the other day that jumped off the page to me. Now, Rich Barris, who's kind of a pollster, he did a poll of Democrat voters. And his question to the people that support the Democrat Party today was pretty simple. So this guy, this is the poll he's conducting. He's asking Democrat voters, this is the question, quote, do you identify with socialism, democratic socialism, or traditional liberalism? Which to me is a funny question because I think it's such a revealing question. I mean, if you have to ask Democrats if they agree with socialism and democratic socialism, I think the plot's already been lost. But here's the results. So again, here's this guy asking Democrats if they identify with socialism, democratic socialism, or traditional liberalism. The results. 59.4% of Democrats identify as democratic socialists. 59.4%. Basically 60% of the Democrat Party identifies as democratic socialists. They don't even know what their politics are. Here's the second highest category. 21.8% of respondents said not sure. You're not sure if you're a Democrat, socialist, or a traditional liberal. So they're not even sure what their political ideas are. They're just doing whatever the party is telling them, would be my inference with that. Whatever the commies say, they're in goose step with. So there's a steep drop there. So it goes down to 12.6% of people in the Democrat Party identify as traditional liberals. That is a steep drop, man. I mean, that's crazy to me. 60% of Democrats identify as Democratic Socialists, and only 12% identify as traditional liberals. 6.2% of the electorate identifies as actual socialists. So they have 6% of these people that they're just like, you know what, I don't even bother with the Democratic Party. I'm just a socialist. And it's a small poll, to be fair, but I think it's pretty spot on. The poll itself was 1,112 people. That's not a bad cross-section of Democrats, but it's just so interesting. 59.4% is Democratic Socialist and 21.8% is unsure. So when you aggregate that, so you got 80 to 81% of people in the Democrat Party that see themselves as socialists or unsure. And I looked at it like traditional liberalism, 12.6%. Those folks are in the wrong party. Because if you're a true liberal, you should be in the Republican Party at this point. True liberalism, I think, was abandoned like right after the civil rights era. But the Democrat National Convention, the DNC, the power brokers in the Democrat Party, they abandoned true liberalism quite a while ago. And just to back away from this entire thing, because I'm not surprised by any of it, because the Democrat Party has been trending this way for years. But now what you're seeing is a plurality of people emerging in the Democrat Party that identify as socialists. And that trend of the base gives you the candidates that the Democrat Party offers. People like AOC, people like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Mandami up in New York. Those people are basically socialist communists. But Mandami he's the mask off guy. And you can tell because that's where their base is. The base of the Democrat Party wants socialism and communism. They do. That's why there's so much excitement to get a real communist out and be the darling of the party. They want Mandami to be the face of the party. That's exactly why Mandami has been so elevated in a national viewpoint. And I talk about AOC on the show. If you look at like a Mandami and AOC, those people represent the base. The energy of a political party is always in the base. It's just the same as on the right. The energy is always in the base. The base right is America First, MAGA, I guess awake conservatives. It's basically right-wing national populism is the base of the Republican Party. That, again, that's the base, that's the energy. But it's interesting to me, like when you look at this bend of the Democrat Party more towards socialism, if you start getting into the demographics of it, it gets even more interesting. Here's a New York Times Siena poll. So here's this poll. So New York Times Siena, opinion of socialism among potential Democrat supporters. So it's asking people in the Democrat Party, what is their opinion of socialism? The favorable view to socialism is 49% in the Democrat Party. So basically 1 out of every 2 people in the Democrat Party has a favorable view of socialism. And the interesting thing about that is trending at a plus 27% rate. Plus 27. So there's been this huge jump in acceptance of socialist principles in the Democrat Party. The unfavorables towards socialism in the Democrat Party is 22%. 22% of people in the Democrat Party oppose socialism. So they've read a history book. But I started looking at some of these. It's just interesting to me when you look at the age breakout. So if you look at people 65 and older in the Democrat Party, it's only a plus 7. Okay, so it's going up. 45 to 64 is plus 24 towards socialism. Ages 30 to 44 is plus 30 towards socialism. this is the killer to me. Age 18 to 29 plus 36. So you have these younger people that are trending. The line gets continually bigger the younger people get in the demographic breakdown of age. You have single digits, 65 and older, and then it gets all the way up to 36%. And 36% is trending above the plus 27 in the favorable overall. And it's interesting because you start looking at like the demographics on this. White college educated plus 32. White no college plus 23. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. White folks plus 28, black folks plus 27, Hispanic plus 14. I mean, that is crazy that you're seeing those numbers. Again, a favorable view of socialism at a plus 27 to get you to basically 50% of the electorate in the Democrat Party. And again, you can look at these numbers just off the page. It tells you that socialism is the energy behind the party. And to be fair, look, I look at this age breakout because I think it's interesting. Capitalism doesn't work for a 25-year-old. A Gen Z kid, which is that age bracket, that 18 to 29, that Gen Z kid gets absolutely zero benefit from a capitalist system. These kids have tons, and they were all promised that they would just, all you have to do is just go to college and everything will be fine. Well, these kids are graduating college. You're like 24 years old. You've got tons of debt. Everything's expensive. Imagine being a 24 or 25-year-old right now. You got all this debt, can't buy a home. Homes are unaffordable. I mean, your insurance for a car, home, anything is totally out of control expensive. They've got vehicle costs. They've got student debt. I mean, that's got to be crushing for kids that are Gen Z. And look, if I'm Gen Z, you're sitting here telling me that capitalism works and I'm a Gen Z 25 broke kid. If I'm an alert 25-year-old, regardless of political party, I'm looking at the boomer class in DC and I'm puking all over myself. Or I'm just absolutely furious. Again, imagine being a 25-year-old. You can't get out of the hole that you've been put in by people that should have known better. And then you're looking at these people in DC. Imagine being a 25-year-old and looking at people like Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, AOC, a John Thune, Mike Johnson, Mitch McConnell. I mean, if you're an awake 25-year-old, you're looking at people like that in DC on both sides of the aisle and saying, these people are just paper thin actors. It's a total clown show. None of those people that I just mentioned are leaders. There's no leader there. There's no George Washington that's in that mix that you're like, man, I really want to follow that guy. And look, I've been watching politics for almost 50 years. Do I think anybody in that group could solve anything serious? Absolutely. I don't think any one of those people could even manage a lemonade stand. They don't even know how to add. They're actors that get on and provide sound bites to places like MSNBC and CNN, and they're feted by the media. But if I'm a 25-year-old Gen Z kid and I'm looking at what my options are, the conclusion that I would draw is that people in DC and in my federal government have been robbing the citizenry blind for decades and lying to them. And all these people like the Mitch McConnells and all these people that have been in government for 40, 50 years, these people are the same people that kicked the can down the road. They kept kicking the can down the road economically, socially, you name it. They avoided pain. So by them avoiding pain to keep getting reelected, they kept stealing from the treasury. They kept stealing from my kids' future. And what these Gen Z kids are realizing is that bill is coming due. And the really galling part for a 25-year-old is the people that racked up this enormous debt and put their future in hock. These people are golden parachuting out. Mitch McConnell's got like $100 million. You think Bernie Sanders and his 3 mansions really cares about you in the struggle? I mean, AOC was a bartender that got a job as a congressional. Now she's worth millions of dollars. But again, if I'm some 25-year, even if I was a conservative 25-year-old, I'd be like, man, the system's got to change. It's got to break. And that's why socialism is trending in the base of the Democrat Party. It's a disillusionment with the status quo. You're going to have militant right-wing nationalism or you're going to have socialism, communism. And that's a real problem because the fact of the matter is that Kids today are not taught civics or history. They don't understand the problem with socialism. Socialism is a palatable alternative because they're like, hey, at least I get a piece of it. At least maybe in this system I can get a piece of it instead of being told capitalism is so great by a rich managerial class in DC that's all octogenarians. They're octogenarians that are thieves and fools and they're lying to my face. Yeah, if I'm 25, I'm looking for a different alternative. A new system is preferred if I'm that age. But it's just very interesting to me to see the shift towards socialism and communism. Favorable opinion of socialism in the Democrat Party, 49%. Man, you got problems. Just crazy. Trust me, I'll be watching it. So switching gears, I've been thinking a lot about the Supreme Court the last few weeks, and I've been talking a lot about it. But there have been so many landmark Supreme Court decisions in U.S. history, and I think we just lived through one. And really, when you look at like the Supreme Court and the decisions that they make since the founding, it's almost like a Lego set. It's almost like the founders like laid down like a foundation of Lego bricks. So the bricks are laid down by the founders, and what that does is it sets the base for the next decision and the next decision and the next decision. And that was really the intent of the founders, was to build a set of bricks with a train of logic. But I mean, really what you're talking about when you talk about America, you're talking about law. And you can track almost every issue legally since the founding. Well, probably the biggest explosion of law was the Civil War. The Civil War itself gave you this explosion of legal precedents and landmarks that we, quite frankly, we still deal with today. And what was that explosion? Well, the Reconstruction of the American South post-Civil War gave you the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments. Those three amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, were passed from 1865 to 1870, so right after the Civil War ended. And those three amendments are known as the Reconstruction Amendments. And broadly, what those three things did, it abolished slavery, addressed citizenship, it gave you equal protection rights, prohibits discrimination. And if you're asking me, as far as like global historical significance, I think those three amendments, meaning is added on past the Bill of Rights, those three amendments added onto the Constitution, to me, represent the intellectual high watermark of the Republic. And what those three things did is it made the promise of the Declaration of Independence whole. If you look at political science study of the Reconstruction Amendments were basically codifying the Declaration of Independence that all men were created equal. Those amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, those were the legal construct of civil rights for all citizens, not just white men. So we were able to move away. That was the whole point, make the experiment better. Make everything better, build on the foundation, build the Lego kit out. Well, of course, what happened was when the 13th, the 14th, and 15th Amendment were passed, there were situations that arose where these amendments were litigated. So you would have a case that would come up, okay, we're going to test the 13th Amendment. We're going to test the 14th Amendment. Situations always arise to test these new laws. It's no different than the Second Amendment, First Amendment, whatever it is. Because you just create it, you put it on a piece of paper, that doesn't mean there's any thought behind it. But the biggest case that was impacted by the Reconstruction Amendments was a case called Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, you might have heard Plessy versus Ferguson mentioned somewhere a lot, and that's normally in the media. The media talks about Plessy versus Ferguson a lot, and it's studied extensively in case law, like in political science. And I just wanted to go through what Plessy versus Ferguson was, just so you understand what the context of this whole thing was, this case, and why it was so bad for America. But the entire Plessy versus Ferguson case originated in 1892. So what, about 30 years past the Civil War? Well, the entire situation that came is that this guy named Homer Plessy started this whole issue with Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy was a mixed race person. So he's half black, half white. He deliberately boarded a whites only train in New Orleans. Well, the state of Louisiana at the time had a law called the Separate Car Act of 1890. Well, that law, that Separate Car Act in 1890 in the state of Louisiana, that required, so this is state law in Louisiana, that state law required equal but separate accommodations for blacks and whites as far as trains went. So they had this segregation codified into state law, and Plessy decided to challenge it by getting on this train. So Plessy goes ahead and boards this whites-only train. What he did, he violated state law. Regardless of whether or not it should have been a law is irrelevant at this point. Laws are not racist. He violated a written law. Well, Plessy then was charged for violating this Louisiana Separate Car Act. That was the legal predicate for Plessy to be charged. He broke the law. Well, the case for Plessy was then given to a Louisiana judge, and that judge was a guy named John Ferguson. So again, Plessy breaks this law. He doesn't like it. He did it deliberately. The case goes before a Louisiana judge named John Ferguson. Well, Plessy's lawyers in the state of Louisiana in front of this judge argued that the Separate Car Act itself by the state of Louisiana was unconstitutional. They said, hey, this violates the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. This is unconstitutional. You can't have a whites-only train. Well, this Judge Ferguson guy denied that logic. So that was the first benchmark, and the Judge Ferguson denied the logic that what he did was that it was unconstitutional for Louisiana to have a law like that. That case, after Ferguson nuked Plessy, that case was then appealed to the Louisiana Supreme Court. It goes through the appeals process. So what happened then is that the Louisiana Supreme Court, they agreed with Judge Ferguson. They agreed that it was not unconstitutional to have equal but separate train accommodations for black and white folks. Well, again, appeals process. Plessy then appeals the Louisiana Supreme Court decision to the Supreme Court. Well, a couple years later in 1896, the Supreme Court of the United States of America ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson. The Supreme Court ruled against Plessy. What their logic was is that the Supreme Court, in this decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court did not believe, they did not agree that the Louisiana Separate Car Act was unconstitutional. I talked about the Reconstruction Amendments viewed through this case. The argument that Plessy and his lawyers were making, this was the argument Plessy made to the Supreme Court. The argument was that the 14th Amendment established legal equality of whites and blacks. So why are we being separated? And to be fair, Plessy and his lawyers were correct legally. The 14th Amendment is pretty clear here. And again, I am a textualist originalist. If you read the 14th Amendment, here's the 14th Amendment. Quote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state in which they reside. End quote. Are citizens of the United States and of the state in which they reside. It doesn't say black citizens. It doesn't say white citizens. It says all persons are citizens of the United States and the state in which they reside. All persons are citizens, not black citizens, not white citizens. So Plessy was correct. And that's the whole point of the Constitution. It's a colorblind document. And I talked about this in the Louisiana versus Callis decision. We're all American citizens. We don't have white districts. We don't have black districts. We're all the same. We're American citizens. So if you look at Plessy's argument from this entire case with Plessy versus Ferguson, Plessy's argument was legally correct, but the Supreme Court did not agree. The Supreme Court was not stopped by that logic. In fact, the Supreme Court, the ruling on this was 7-1 against Plessy. So the Supreme Court ruled 7-1 that the state of Louisiana's law for separate but equal rail cars wasn't unconstitutional. And to be fair, the fact that it's 7-1, that's wrong. the Supreme Court argument, when they came out with the 7-1 in the majority, was pretty dense. What they did, they wanted to split the baby here. The Supreme Court agreed. It agreed in its majority opinion that the 14th Amendment established the legal equality of whites and blacks. So check. So you're all equal legally. So they agree with that predicate of the 14th Amendment. But the crazy thing about it is that the Supreme Court then did not believe that the 14th Amendment would require the elimination of, quote, distinctions based on color, end quote. It's a horrible decision. And I said splitting the baby. That's the best way to think about it. The court's argument in the majority opinion was splitting the baby. On one hand, you're agreeing on the legality of the 14th Amendment for racial equality. So you agree with the predicate of racial equality, but on the other hand, the court is then saying that it doesn't agree that discrimination on race is appropriate. The court saw the state of Louisiana as a sovereign state, which is really the purpose of federalism. The court held that as a sovereign state, the state of Louisiana could then segregate as long as segregation didn't oppress one class of people. So you're saying segregation is fine as long as it doesn't oppress another group. Well, of course, that's totally intellectually dishonest. Any segregation at all implies that one class is better than another. And of course, everybody understands through the context of the Civil War, the history of slavery, everybody understands that black people were considered inferior to white people in this whole thought process. Why else would you separate them? Because we're all people. We're all citizens. That's my position. So why are you separating them? And obviously, you de facto, what you are realizing is that there is a difference if segregation is needed. But if you distill the decision down and read into Plessy versus Ferguson, what the court was basically saying is that racial prejudice could not be legislated. How disappointing is that these are people that are supposed to be in charge of the courts, right? A court is saying that racial prejudice cannot be legislated. Here's the Supreme Court. This is their own word. And again, this is why these dissents, when I make fun of like Justice Jackson for her dissent, this stuff matters for posterity. I have to read it to understand what people are thinking. Here's the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson. Quote, "The object of the 14th was undoubtedly to enforce the absolute equality of the two races before the law. But in the nature of things, it could not have been intended to abolish distinctions based on color or to enforce social as distinguished from political equality or a commingling of the two races on terms unsatisfactory to each other." That is shocking. That's shocking. Quote, "The object of the 14th was undoubtedly to enforce the absolute equality of the two races before the law," end quote. They answered their own question. So they're agreeing that there should be absolute equality, but then we're not going to abolish distinctions based on color. That is the logic there is so circuitous. It's totally dense. It's a shocking writing that cries out from history. The only dissent, I said, was 7-1. There was a dissent. That one dissent was a guy named John Harlan. Now, John Harlan actually got Plessy correct. Harlan absolutely nailed this whole thing. Here's Harlan in his dissent. And again, this is why this matters. Here's Harlan, quote, "The white race deems itself to be the dominant race in this country. And so it is in prestige, in achievements, in education, in wealth, and in power. But in the view of the Constitution and the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior dominant ruling class of citizens. There is no caste here. Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. The humblest is the peer of the most powerful. The law regards man as man and takes no account of his surroundings or his color when his civil rights is guaranteed by the supreme law of the land are involved. Thank you, sir. End quote. It's totally right. The white race deems itself to be dominant race in this country, and so it is. But in the view of the Constitution and the eye of the law, there is no one in this country superior, dominant, ruling class. There is no caste. Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. The humblest is the peer of the most powerful. That is the correct interpretation of the Constitution. John Harlan understood the Constitution. That is a brilliantly written dissent. He wrote it for posterity. Absolutely brilliant dissent by Harlan. Well, beyond the actual implications of the Plessy ruling, there was so much rotten fruit that came out of the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling. What happened after Plessy, after this 7-1 that states could now discriminate? The Plessy decision basically legitimized at the federal level racial discrimination. States now, because of this decision, had legal cover for segregation. This entire decision with Plessy versus Ferguson, this entire legal mistake created what you now know today as separate but equal. The Plessy decision effectively undermined the Reconstruction Amendments because it circumvented them. Not only did the Plessy decision short circuit the 13th, 14th, and 15th, but I just mentioned it a minute ago, it allows states to absorb powers to discriminate now. States now had a green light, they had legal permission to create race-based laws. The only way that legal racism could now be litigated would be if there was no equality in the separation. Drinking fountains are a great example of this. A state could now legally have separate drinking fountains. And that was fine if they were equal fountains. But they weren't, were they? And what states did, states created racially separate institutions. Of course they would, because this whole idea of institutional equality was a canard. You know, but we're going to give you a nice drinking fountain, and we're going to have a nice drinking fountain too, and then just extrapolate that. It's a total legal canard. It's a canard legally and practically. But this entire, I said rotten fruit, it's fallout. This fallout from Plessy versus Ferguson created Jim Crow laws. And you hear these guys talk about Jim Crow. That's exactly what those were. So those Jim Crow laws were a response to this just terrible ruling of Plessy versus Ferguson. States were allowed and free to create laws that segregated races. So Jim Crow laws, to be totally blunt, were the child of Plessy versus Ferguson. Jim Crow was a series of laws over 50 years introduced post-Plessy that enforced racial segregation on the American people. These Jim Crow laws, these new laws with the legal enfranchisement from the Supreme Court, disenfranchised minorities in the letter of the law. And Plessy versus Ferguson is an absolute blight on the law in America. It was an absolutely just disgusting decision. Not only is Plessy a blight on the Supreme Court, it still haunts us today. It's a stain. But again, like so many things that happen in the Republic over the course of time, Plessy was corrected. And it was corrected by the law, which is the way that it should work. Plessy was corrected by the people. And you might ask yourself, how was Plessy versus Ferguson fixed legally? Well, it's interesting because Plessy versus Ferguson has never been overturned. It's never been overturned. There's never been a ruling that there was, hey, this is wrong or whatever. But in 1951, cracks started emerging in the Plessy versus Ferguson facade. So in 1951 in Topeka, Kansas, there was this daughter of this black guy named Oliver Brown. So this daughter of this black guy named Oliver Brown enters U.S. history and U.S. law. The public school system in Topeka, Kansas, refused to admit Brown's daughter. They refused to admit Brown's daughter at the school closest to their home. The school system was forcing this man's daughter, the school system was forcing Brown's daughter to take a bus to a racially segregated school far away, which was an all-black school. So the Brown family, along with 12 other black families, did a class action lawsuit, and their argument before the law was that this girl should be allowed to attend the closer school and that segregation was unconstitutional. The argument here was that the schools were not equal. That was the whole point of Pleasant. Like, we can be separate, but it has to be equal. They're now arguing that the schools are not equal. And they were right. The black school had less accommodations, poor food, poor education. The daughter is being put through a bus driving charade every day where she has to get on a bus and go far away. Well, that's taking up her time. That's taking up the family's time. The argument for Brown here was that they were arguing that schools were separate, but they were not equal. A district court, it's always the first way in, a district court in Kansas ruled against the Browns in this class action lawsuit. Their argument for pushing back on this, their argument was based on Plessy versus Ferguson. So after this failure at this district court in Kansas, the Brown family then appealed to the Supreme Court. And it's interesting when you look at the Brown versus Board of Education case. As a side note to this entire thing, the Brown family in this lawsuit were represented by the NAACP and Thurgood Marshall. And Thurgood Marshall, just as a historical footnote, was the first black Supreme Court justice. But so Brown versus Board of Education gets to the Supreme Court. Well, what happened in Brown versus Board of Education? The Supreme Court ruled 9-0 in favor of Brown. Now their argument here, so basically what that did is they said, okay, this is discrimination. The main legal argument here for the majority, the 9-0 majority, was psychological, which I do not agree with. Psychological impact should not have anything to do with the rule of law, but that's neither here nor there because it's black and white. Making you feel bad is not a cogent argument, but I agree with the decision overall. So the Supreme Court found that having kids in segregated schools harmed them mentally. Which is true, that segregated schools would evoke some sense of inferiority, which is exactly correct. You know you're going to the, quote, black school. You know you're going to the white school. You're separated. And if the black school is not getting, right, the food, the accommodations, the money, if it's totally different, they're not equal. So this whole idea of evoking this sense of inferiority, even if you said that the schools were equal, even if you said the black school and the white school were totally on par with each other, the impact of segregating kids creates a different perception, a different experience for the child based on race. That's what they got into. So here's the Supreme Court now, 50, 60 years later, post-Plessy, the Supreme Court said in Brown versus Board of Education that segregated public education was inherently unequal. And their basis for this was the 14th Amendment. This is the same 14th Amendment that Plessy versus Ferguson denied, that partially recognized. The 14th Amendment, again, gives you equal protection under the law. That is the correct legal decision. But what happened here more broadly with Brown versus Board of Education is when they ruled that it was unconstitutional to segregate public schools in Kansas, what that did, the Brown decision undermined the legal predicate of Plessy. That's why it was never overturned, because it was undermined. So coming out of Brown versus Board of Education, no longer were whites and blacks separate but equal. They're now viewed as Americans. American children go to American schools. That is a huge thing for equality. We don't have white schools. We don't have black schools. We don't have white drinking fountains. No, we're all Americans. We have an American drinking fountain. So if you look at it through the scope of time and law, those are the legal bookends. Those are the legal bookends to race-based laws in the United States. Plessy versus Ferguson started separate but equal in 1896. It started Jim Crow. Well, then Brown versus Board of Education ended that in 1954. It's so interesting. You had these two rulings that were legal bookends. Those cases set race relations for 50 to 70 years in the United States. Because the United States post Brown versus Board of Education, the United States changed very rapidly with the civil rights movement. Very rapidly. You had Jackie Robinson, you had Martin Luther King, you had desegregated schools. It was a snowball going downhill for civil rights. And this whole snowball going downhill post-Brown led you to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. John F. Kennedy proposed the Civil Rights Act, but he was assassinated. So the Civil Rights Act was actually signed by Lyndon Johnson in 1964. That got very, very granular in federal law. That Civil Rights Act that Johnson signed in 1964, it outlawed discrimination, prohibited segregation, prohibits employment discrimination, prohibits voter segregation. Basically what the Civil Rights Act did is it codified laws that prohibit segregation and discrimination based on race, creed, color, sex, national origin. The Civil Rights Act was then pushed out on steroids by Congress. They couldn't wait to get into this because Congress realized that it could use these acts to regulate interstate commerce. So what they did is Congress got their teeth into this and just started assuming powers. So this was not a good thing for federalism. It was a good thing for civil rights. But every lawsuit after that Civil Rights Act was viewed through the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th. Now, if you kind of play the whole string up, the last piece of that legislation was passed in 1990, and that was the Americans with Disabilities Act, when most people listening lived through that. But the Americans with Disabilities Act was that was the final piece of the civil rights legislation that we've had put into U.S. law. So you had basically 100 years post-Civil War of legal meandering to get to today. And you might be sitting here asking yourself, why is this man talking about Plessy versus Ferguson? Why is he talking about Brown versus Board of Education? And that should be an easy answer. Because what I wanted to get into is that the case that knocked out Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act was Louisiana versus Callis, and I alluded it to earlier in the show, or in this segment, I guess. Louisiana versus Callis found that racially gerrymandered maps were unconstitutional. That's how big that case was. I think it's as big a case as Plessy versus Ferguson. It's as big a case as Brown versus Board of Education. But think of it this way. Brown versus Board of Education stopped racially segregated schools. Louisiana versus Callis, which you just lived through, ended racially separated congressional districts. We're all Americans. We're not black, brown, yellow, red, women, men. We're all Americans. That is the beauty of the colorblind document, and it's a huge win for equality. Well, there's somebody that disagrees, and that would be Justice Jackson. She disagrees with this. And last week, Justice Jackson decided to crawl out, and she spoke about this Louisiana versus Callis decision. So here's Justice Jackson. She's warning an audience at the American Law Institute. She is now warning that the Supreme Court majority may have compromised the court's integrity. I'm trying to read this. May have compromised the court's integrity and impartiality. Here's Justice Jackson in her own words. Jackson, quote, "The parties who were asking us to expedite the judgment were doing so because they were embroiled in a political dispute over whether or not to apply the court's ruling in the context of an ongoing election. The parties came to us and said, please alter your rules so we can essentially have advantage of the context in this political dispute. What I thought is that it should not be something that we do because it would look as though we were doing something unusual to advantage this political party that was asking us for political reasons to do it," end quote. That is outrageous. She's basically saying that the Republican Party is using race for political reasons. This is outrageous that this woman would get out and talk like this. Her dissent, I actually read her dissent. Her dissent in the Callis decision was so dense. That's not liberalism. That is somebody that knows absolutely nothing. The Supreme Court majority found that these racial maps were unconstitutional, correctly, by the way. The Supreme Court used law, used history, used context. They didn't want to make another Plessy versus Ferguson mistake. The Supreme Court majority found racial maps unconstitutional, but Justice Jackson and the minority thought racially carved out maps were fine. How does that compare with anybody that knows anything about Plessy versus Ferguson or Board of Education? This woman that is on the Supreme Court is arguing in 2026 that states should use unconstitutional maps that include race-based segregation. And what planet are we on, man? Is she a racist? Is she dense? I think the easier conclusion to draw is she's just a total partisan. She's a total partisan. She's an activist in robes. Supreme Court justices broadly should not be talking like this publicly. Criticizing your fellow justices should be in your legal writings. If she dissents with what occurs, write out your logic in your dissent. You don't go out in public and rage about it. You don't go rag on your colleagues. It's totally unprofessional. Does anybody listen to this? Do you walk around publicly criticizing your coworkers? You don't have to go that far back to look at like a Justice Scalia, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Those two people vehemently disagreed on absolutely everything. They were yin and yang viewpoints, but they were also very friendly. They hung out outside the court. And that's the point. That's the difference here is a person like Jackson. She's a liberal pundit. She's a CNN host. She's not an arbiter of law. She's not even a CNN host. What she is a vessel for progressivism. Justice Jackson has a progressive worldview, and that worldview shows her how society should behave and operate. The problem with that is that worldview that she carries with her includes the idea that her side must win. Any ruling against her worldview is an offense to her worldview. And legitimacy, I guess, to a person like Justice Jackson is only arrived at when progressives win 100% of the time. And if you believe that your side must win 100% of the time, then you are not an impartial jurist. You can never be impartial. What bothers me about all this is that Justice Jackson and every justice on this, they carry the weight of history on their shoulders. We all do. It is our responsibility to the future to make hard decisions, to make the experiment better, and that is the task that we are given. History, precedent, law, those are obligations to the future. It's to our kids. That's a responsibility, and that's why people like Justice Jackson, Kamala Harris, Obama, Jeffries, Newsom, all of their comments make me mental. Talking about Jim Crow 2.0, they're talking about Jim Crow 2.0 and we're going back to race-based, all this other stuff. It's just obscene to me as somebody that understands history. Because what it does really, and everybody should be mad at it, because what it does, black people especially should be mad about it. It's obscene what they're doing because this commentary of Jim Crow 2.0 and not understanding the Louisiana versus Callis decision, what that does is it actually minimizes the very real struggles that black folks, minorities had the last 200 plus years. How many people fought this, died for it, worked tirelessly, marched for it, for real equality? These folks that I'm talking about, the Jacksons, the Harrises, the Obama, they use race as a political prop. It's a prop for political purposes. And the thing about it is it's much easier to call everyone a racist than sitting here and actually making an intellectual argument based on history and law. Anyway, that is, I've gone over an hour now, my God. That's the legal bookends of racial law. Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Board of Education, and now we have another one in Louisiana versus Callis. And you lived through it. How amazing. Guys, history is a chain. Law is a thread. But trust me, I'll be watching all this stuff. So just a quick programming note. I don't know how many shows I'll get out this week. Obviously, we're doing one today. We have a short week, and then I'm going to be out of town next week. So I'm going to hope to get another show out, maybe early part of next week. But just stay tuned and keep watching Spotify. We'll get some shows out for you. So anyway, I'll go ahead and wrap the show up. If you like the show, please go ahead and tell a friend about it. If you would, please follow us on Spotify. You can also follow us on Instagram at Foggy Dew Daily. If you have questions for the show, please go ahead and email us at foggydew95@gmail.com. But in the meantime, I'd ask you to say a prayer, ask questions, and stay vigilant. This is the Foggy Dew, signing off.